Peter W. Mullin, and I was born in South Pasadena, California. Well, the first time I met John was probably 20 years ago or so. I was lucky enough to become a member of a group called the Sunset Club, and John was a long-term member, and so it was a real thrill to get acquainted with him. Frankly, I hadn't heard of John Myers before I met him, but I certainly learned about him a lot after I met him, because he was famous among the Sunset Club group, but famous among the flying world, the aeronautical world. So if you talk to anybody from the field of aeronautics, the name John Myers was certainly well known. John was a very interesting man in that he had accomplished a tremendous amount during his long career. Probably the best known test pilot ever, the man Jack Northrop trusted the most, actually serving as general counsel for Northrop until he told Jack that he was a better test pilot than any of the pilots that Jack had, and he wanted to apply for that job too, which Jack agreed, and John proved it. But astronauts like Chuck Yeager would tell you and told me that there was no better pilot ever than John Myers, and that if he were ever in trouble in an airplane and somebody had to take the controls, he wanted John to be in charge. Well, a handshake with John Myers was better than a 40-page contract. And the interesting thing is that when you quiz John about his background and his history, he really didn't want to talk about that. He was more interested in talking about you. So he would turn the tables and say, tell me about you. Tell me about how you got interested in this. Why did you do that? What kind of hobbies do you have? Tell me more about that. So he was very interested in other people and in what made them tick, which is probably why everybody that knew him loved him. I mean, he was probably one of the handful of people in my entire life that I've met that you could not find an enemy. John had friends for life, a long life and friends for life. I remember at his funeral services where the room was packed with people, all of whom thought John was their best friend, which is, I guess, one of the great tributes and legacies that you could hear about a man, is that everybody thought he was their best friend. Well, I have one example of character in tough times, which is at a Sunset Club outing up at his ranch, actually, the Flying M Ranch. He had a helicopter up there, and he said, well, why don't you guys come up with me, it'll take a little helicopter ride. I wasn't in the helicopter at the time that he went up and had engine failure, and calm and steely and cool as ever, he said, not to worry guys, we'll just auto-rotate down, which he did, and it was a bump on landing and a couple of bruises, but nobody got hurt. And that was John. He says, well, that happens from time to time, so you just do what you got to do and stay calm. Well, I don't think John ever told me, but it was told to me that a prototype aircraft during the war that Northrop had designed, John told Jack Northrop, you know, Jack, this plane is never going to fly. It doesn't fly, it can't fly. But by the way, if anybody is going to fly it, it's going to be me. And he tested it and crashed, and the plane didn't survive, but John did, thank God. Totally a man's man. Whatever it was that you loved doing, whether it was ranching, hiking, bird shooting, taking a trip down to Mexico, having a crystal yum yum late at night, John was your man. He, right through his early 90s, would be the last guy to go to bed. Very funny guy, but in a dry sort of way. He was a keen observer of humankind, and so when he had a comment to make, was a good idea to listen to what he had to say, and he always put a humorous twist on it, even when you knew he was kind of poking you for something you might have said that you wish you could jam back in your mouth. I think he was a very wise man, probably because of his training, his legal training, and then his pilot training, then his testing training. He had seen it all, he'd experienced it all. So it gave him that great opportunity to reflect by thinking backwards on his life and drawing conclusions from his experiences, which developed a philosophy that he was quite willing to share with you if you were interested and asked. He didn't push his philosophy on anybody, but he was happy to share it if you were interested. John was an absolute lover of cars. I think he actually loved anything mechanical that was also beautiful, sculpturally beautiful, like an airplane, and that was capable of high performance. So I'm a aficionado and collector of French cars, mostly from the 30s, that had significant racing histories. And John just loved that idea. He loved to look at them, he loved to listen to them, he loved to look under the hood at the engineering and marvel at the brilliant artistry that went on underneath the hood, not just on the outside. So we spent many a day or an afternoon actually here in this garage wandering around looking at cars and talking about them. And of course he himself owned some phenomenal cars and didn't mind driving them hard and fast. He would open the hood and he'd know what he was looking at, and you better be on your toes. He'd say, "Peter, what's this over here? This doesn't look like it probably ought to be just like that." And if you didn't know that that was a twin magneto and actually it was belonged there, even though it looked like an airplane part, then you felt kind of foolish. So it was good to know what you were talking about when you started answering John's questions. Well, I think John only had one speed, which was fast, and I'm sure it was born out of his love of being a test pilot and the thrill, the energy that you get from performance. But he loved to drive fast, he loved to live fast, he loved to test himself and to prove that whatever came his direction he could handle. And I think it probably is one of those things that kept him alive so long and so alert and so interested and so curious about the world, is because he looked at the world on a fast clip basis. I learned a lot from John. I hope that I have 50% of the energy and interest that he showed during his life. And the thing I probably learned the most from John is the importance of being interested in other people as opposed to hoping they're interested in you. And I think that's probably why he made such tremendous lifetime friends, is that, they say that winners listen and losers wait until it's their turn to talk. And John was a winner because he always listened. I have heard that he was a mentor to a lot of pilots, military pilots and test pilots. They used to call him Maestro in his test pilot days, because he would take those young pilots under his wing and probably teach them more than just the art of flying, but the art of living. And so in that sense, I'm sure he was a mentor to a great many people. In my experience with John, I just loved to hang around him and learn and listen, and he was a mentor in terms of teaching you how to live life to the fullest. John kind of downplayed courage, but he definitely showed it. I love the story of when he was a student at Stanford, and he got in an airplane and figured out how to take off, and took off in an airplane solo on his first flight, flew around for a while. The students gathered around to see if he could actually bring it back down. He decided he better land it. He'd never landed an airplane before. Brought it down, landed it, got out. People were aghast that he would actually try this. He said, wasn't that big a deal. You kind of point it in the right direction and you come down slow and you get level and you land it. I mean, what's the big deal? I did know Lucia for a few years after I met John. I'd see he and Lucia together frequently, and she was a powerful, beautiful, articulate, very striking woman who was also very smart and on the board of a number of major companies here in Southern California and Northern California, and so certainly a match for John, and the two of them together made quite a couple. Well, the generation that John came from, which is World War II and post-World War II, you know, times were tough. People made it on their own. There weren't a lot of silver spoons to pass around. So I remember growing up reading the Reader's Digest, where there was always that piece on my most unforgettable character. And John certainly fits the profile of the most unforgettable character, because everything that he accomplished in his great life he seemed to do on his own, with his own internal fortitude, and that probably was symptomatic of the post-war era, but he certainly proved that point dramatically. Well, I remember a very interesting moment with John. I was going to go down to Mexico on a quail hunt, and John said, well, why don't you ride down with me? I'm taking my plane down. I think it was a Citation 2. So I flew down with John, and we landed in Mexico and had a great weekend. And I happened to call my wife, Merle, and said, well, I got a plane ride down here, so I didn't have to drive down the 7 or 8 hours that it was going to take. And she said, well, you know, who did you fly with? And I said, well, it's a pilot that I ran into that said, seems like a great guy, and we had a nice flight, but you know, he's 90 years old. And my wife started shrieking on the other end of the phone and said, Peter, what are you talking about? You're flying with a 90-year-old pilot? And then I laughed and told her the pilot was Johnny. And in fact, I think he kept flying until he was about 93. He told me once that he flew solo until he was 90, and then he decided maybe he better take a co-pilot with him, not because he needed him, but because his hearing had waned some, and that he couldn't hear the tower telling him, you know, which runway to land on. Maybe it was a good idea to bring a pilot with him. So he had a 40-year-old co-pilot who was late when we wanted to take off and come back to the U.S., and he's typically John, you know, walking around grumbling, stamping his foot, saying, where the heck is this young whippersnapper? And he turned to me and he said, you know, Peter, I told you that I didn't really need this co-pilot. Let's just get out of here. We'll leave him here. So that was John. John, I think, had one of those extraordinary attributes of absolutely admiring, loving, celebrating, respecting women. I think probably his love of sculpture, of beautiful curves and beautiful things, caused John to really celebrate the fairer sex, probably from the time he was very young all the way through to the end of his great life. And he was always respectful, courteous to women, and always made them feel very good. When they walked away from a conversation with John, they felt better for it. Well, the proud moment that I could think of is probably several proud moments, but it's one where when I would come into a room, he would come over and kind of stick his hand out, put his arm on my shoulder, and tell me that he missed seeing me and was really looking forward to spending more time together. And of course, that made me feel like $1 million when Johnny Myers did that. I'm sure he did that to a lot of people. He's going to be remembered as somebody that they broke the mold after they made him. I mean, you're not going to see another profile like Johnny. He's kind of a one-off character, the most unforgettable character, and I think all of us will long remember him up there as you know, a great pilot and the heavens, and I kind of see him smiling down on all of us. He knew how to have a good time.
Great.
That'll work. Thanks very much, Peter.
All right.
Nice to meet you too.
Nice to meet you.